Hello, everybody. All around the world, people stand up against the corona restrictions and mandates. The most prominent example on everybody's mind, of course, is the convoy in Canada, the truck convoy. Today, I want to talk about the German version of the protest, which also is quite original, I would say, the so-called street walks or Spaziergänge in German. Spaziergang would be the singular. What's characteristic about them is that they are decentralized. There is not a single major institution or organization behind them. It's rather that people just flood the streets in various cities and, more importantly, actually, in small villages and towns. So it's not like your general protest that just assembles in capitals around federal buildings, let's say. But it is average people in small towns and communities showing up on the streets. And the reason for that should be pretty obvious because after years and years of people trying to register whatever cause they had, all of these organizations had been defamed as Nazi-like. It didn't matter what the cause was it immigration restriction or be it early anti-corona protests, no matter what the causes were, all these groups were eventually decried as the rebirth of Nazism. And that is falling apart right now because people are no longer scared, or at least no longer scared enough to just sit at home and watch as their own country crumbles. And first I wanted to acknowledge how easy it is to actually get registered. So as an alternative strategy of, remaining completely unregistered, you still have the strategy of registering in small groups or as individuals, because it is a basic right in the constitution for every citizen to register a protest. You can't just simply drop a letter or a fax or make a phone call to an authority, a local authority that is responsible for the registration of your protests. That's different in different regions. And, you just really have to tell them your name, the time and place, how long it's going to last approximately, how many people you feel responsible for, what kind of material you're going to use, or are you expecting people to carry banners, for example, or loudspeakers, etc. And you just really have to drop a letter into the letterbox of the responsible office, or alternatively, that can be the police station. You have to look, regionally who is responsible, and just drop that letter into a letterbox or maybe on the doorsteps if the letterbox is already filled. You don't actually have to wait for a reply. Once you have registered and notified that you're going to protest, you have a right to do so, and you don't have to wait for any permission. There is no permission. And the reason why so many of these events remain unregistered is probably because people fear that their data is being abused. They want to remain anonymous. You see that on the internet too. People like to prefer to remain, with a pseudonym, or they don't want to show their faces anymore, particularly when they try to speak out against the government. And in this climate of fear, people fear that they will lose their jobs or they will lose their reputation once they register on, with an authority. And this is partially justified and partially not. Okay, first the why it's not. There are a lot of rules in place that stop usually one government body to give information to a different government body. And if it's all local, it is very difficult for the administrators to aggregate the information and to differ who took part in the protest and who did not. It remains on a local level. On the other hand, the reason why it may be dangerous is bad experience. We had a couple of years ago these so-called Pegida protests, you may remember them. And there was one guy who was wearing a funny hat and sunglasses, and he didn't want to be recognized as. This is why he dressed the way he did. And he was referred to in the newspaper as the hat citizen. And he basically just emerged out of the crowd. On the flip side, we have had bad experience with people trying to attend protests and how they are bullied. And just a couple of years ago, there was this one guy who took part at a Pegida protest. He was identified as the head citizen in the newspapers. He had sunglasses and a hat, and basically all he did was telling media people that he doesn't want to talk to them and that it is actually his right to be left alone. And they took this like blood in the water and find out who he was. And eventually his workplace was leaked, and then he was removed from his job. He was sent to a different department, I think. He was removed from his job. So it is a danger to be on a protest that is against the government in Germany. Therefore, people may refrain from not registering their protests. Normally, of course, you are safer if you register because they can fine you if you're not. The grounds on which they are allowed to stop you from protesting are very few because it's a constitutional right, as I already said. There are two sets of criteria. One for the police. The police can end a protest when it gets out of hand, and the other is the authority, the office where you might register your protest, that can ban a protest if it's very likely that you're going to have a riot. And of the criteria for the police, there is this restriction that you cannot bear weapons. We don't have a Second Amendment, and you cannot bear weapons during a protest march. And if you're not cooperative, so if you're, for example, if you're a leader of a protest and somebody is carrying a weapon, it is your obligation to ask that person to remove himself or his weapon from the protest, and then you can continue. But if you're not cooperative, then the police can end your protest. Additionally, the police can end your protest if it emerges that the leader of the protest is a member of a banned organization or group or political party. We have a communist party that is banned completely. There are also some small organizations that are verboten, and this is independent of whether this person was registered or not. Whoever emerges as the leader of the protest, somebody who is taking the loudspeaker or somebody who is very prominent on the scene, is obviously leading the crowd, then the police can assume this is the leader, and therefore the group can be stopped. As you may guess by now, it is very difficult for the authorities to actually dissolve a protest or to ban it effectively, and the reason is because there are a lot of precedents, legal precedents, that were made actually in response to all these left-wing protests in the past, and they showed that even if the law sounds very strict, in practice it had often been said that the police acted unjustly by dissolving a protest, and therefore the actual law is much more mild than the sound of the text suggests. The first thing you have to know is that there are 5 criteria with which a human right can be restricted. Now, this sounds very odd to American ears or to English ears in general, because in general conversations, you don't talk about what's the core of a right and what's more of the fringe of a right. You just assume this is my right to, let's say, speech, or this is my right to carry a weapon. But of course, all of these rights do have some restrictions in place. So, for example, the right to carry a gun in America would also be limited. You must not be a felon, for example, if you want to purchase a gun legally, and then you need licenses, etc., etc. So there are restrictions to human rights or to individual rights, constitutional rights in general, and that is the case with basically every single of them. However, there is a core that must never be touched, and I'm going to discuss this in a moment. So likewise, in term law, individual rights can also be restricted, but there are 5 criteria. They are called the limits, Schranken-Schranken, because they limit the government's right to limit your individual right. And the first of these limits is the law requirement. So you need a proper law passed by the parliament, which is a long winding process, and it's fairly transparent. You need a formal law with which a human right is restricted. No other government body, not a local office or a police station or whatever, can violate your human rights without a basis in that law, in a law permitting them to violate your right. The second one is that whenever that happens, the authority must quote exactly that law on the basis of which your rights are violated. For example, I saw a lot of articles justifying the protest bans with disease control, but there isn't actually anything in the assembly law that justifies ending a protest for disease control. The closest match I could find was paragraph 13.1.4 in the Versammlungsgesetz law, which allows a protest to be stopped when it violates the criminal code or carries out a misdemeanor. As I've already said, there is a good body of precedents, and the misdemeanor must be huge. It must be a riot. It must be a really big thing, actually, or you must stop a train or stop the traffic. You must actually carry out a misdemeanor that's an actual issue for other citizens, and restrictions on the spread of a disease that is also comparatively mild, mind you, is not a justification for violating a human right. And this is also the third limits the proportionality principle, Verhältnismäßigkeitsgebot. The state must not violate your human rights upon small misdemeanors. It is not good enough for the police to just detect your unmasked face to, pull you out of a protest march. Everybody knows that the aerosols are not very infectious outdoors. They are rather blown away by the wind, etc. We all know it's safe, and in most cases, the police would not enforce the mask mandates outdoors anyways. So if the police comes and tries to take away your right to protest, it must not do so on the grounds of a minor violation. You may get a ticket, a little fine or whatever, but your basic human right of being there for the protest, this must not be violated on the grounds that you are conducting, that you have some minor misconduct. I shall add, however, that you should pick your fights wisely. So even though you know it's nonsense to wear a mask outdoors, even though nobody does ever outside of protests, there are so many things right now that really suck. Just don't invite any conflict if you can avoid it, and focus on your message. Just focus on being out there, focus on talking to others who are also out there, and also share what grievances you have had during the pandemic or beyond. Your business may have been closed or whatever, and share your personal experiences with other people. I think this is more important than not wearing that stupid mask. Fourth limit is that the state must not pass laws that are for individual cases. So if the state says it bans all anti-constitutional or anti-free democratic order protests, there must be a law applied to all protests by the parliament, which it cannot pass a law that just says that Islamists may not protest against the free democratic order and then give everybody else a pass. No, there must be a general law. So the fourth limits is that there must be the laws must be general and cannot be and are not allowed to be individualized. And the last limit is the Wesensgehaltgarantie. The core of your human rights must not be violated. And what that means is that, as I've already mentioned, and this is the case across all jurisdictions, also in America, there are some limits to rights in general, even though we publicly don't really discuss that very often. That is the case. Your taxation does actually violate your right to possess things because it takes away something from you. Likewise, if you are fined for a crime, your possession is taken away from you. But the core, that you are allowed, that you are entitled to have possessions, and that you're free to accumulate possessions, those may never ever be violated. You are still always entitled to possessions, even though currently you may have nothing, currently you may be in debt, but you have a right to accumulate something. Likewise, the state must not tell you that you cannot protest for a given cause. It can say you are banned from protesting on this day for this cause in this place, because they don't want the communists and the Nazis to have a battle at, at a square. But you are generally allowed to protest for, let's say, communism. And if it's banned that day, you can still protest for that cause the other day. They cannot entirely take away your right to protest for the cause. The legal precedent that's most important for this was the Supreme Court verdict of 1985 around the Proctor's anti-nuclear power station protest. Since then, the assembly law has not been changed in substantial manners. There were some tiny changes, like the mentioned ban on protesting on Holocaust memorial sites. But outside of that, there have been no changes to that ruling, and therefore what the judges said in the day still applies to the legal situation today. The Proctor case was a very violent protest, and not only was it unregistered, it was also banned in advance because even though it was not registered, the authorities saw it coming, and they judged that there were so many calls for violence in advance that it is likely to be a riot, and therefore it was officially banned at the time. And in 1985, the Supreme Court ultimately decided that dissolving that protest was illegal, and the number of injuries ran into 1,040 at the time. There were around 800 participants of the protest and 240 police officers were injured. In one case, a police officer, was clubbed on his head with a club and with a spade by two people, and they were also throwing Molotov cocktails and threw stones. So that was quite a riot. So if you remember, the misdemeanors can give rise to ending a protest. The Supreme Court decided that even if somebody hits somebody else with a spade on the head, is not enough to end an entire protest. The police estimates that around 3,000 people were well-organized militants, rioters, engaging in violence, and 1,000 people stormed the property of the construction site. Now compare those riots to, protests where people are unmasked outdoors. I can also say, well, only because there are these riots at the Proctor construction site, how do I know that the streetwalkers are more peaceful? And the answer is because if it were 3,000 people rioting, you would hear it internationally. I would hear it nationally. I saw some evidence of violence, like little brawls, but I did not see anything on a scale. It's not like in Proctor, they already arrived with helmets and Molotov cocktails and so on. This is a very different ballpark. But the authorities also don't fear rioting. As I've mentioned in a lot of newspaper articles, they are talking about infection risks and disease control. So I found one order of the town of Ostfildern. That's a very small town. But I think it's exemplary for how the authorities try to justify protest bans. And the best they could do was quote the state order of Baden-Württemberg, the state of Baden-Württemberg, which in turn also, because there's this law quote requirement with the limits, as you remember, they quoted in turn the parliament law, the official law, paragraphs 28 to 32 in the infection law IFSG, infection control law IFSG. Unsurprisingly, that law does not speak about dispersing a protest at all. As I've already mentioned, protests are a special type of gatherings. They are your human right. It's not like you're up on a party or just some convention. It is your basic human right, without which you could not organize a majority in your interest, which is the core of the democratic procedure. You must be able to gather, you must be able to talk freely, and there is no government authority that can entirely touch that core of that very basic right. You are free to protest your cause. This must never be touched. So what that law actually says, the closest to ending a protest march, would be paragraph 28(1), sentence 2 of the IFSG law. And here it says that an event or a gathering that's unpolitical can be ended or can be dissolved if there is a presence of one or more highly infectious individuals. Now that means an actually highly infectious individual with a grave disease. So we are actually talking something like the bubonic plague or the smallpox, something on that order, because the law also speaks in one breath of an infectious corpse. It is very unlikely that on a COVID-19 protest you will see a dead corpse and a highly infectious individual killing people in its environment. We are talking about a lethality rate of 0.03. I have forgotten how much it was, but the survival rate is like 99 blah 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 percent. You get the picture. If it comes to an infringement of your human rights, that would not be good enough. With that mindset, if a disease that has a survival rate of 99 is a reason to end a protest, then basically any protest could be ended, because somebody will probably have a flu occasionally. You need actually something like the bubonic plague to end a gathering that is to protest. So it's the very core of your human right to gather in groups. Now, outside of that being a human right and the proportionality must be kept, and COVID is not a bubonic plague, the regulations that they are quoting, that they must quote for their numerous rules, COVID restrictions on the protests, they are found in law 28A of the IFSG Infection Protection Law, and that section requires the epidemic situation of national significance, epidemische Lage von nationaler Tragweite, that's the German term, and that one sounds like a match, obviously, that word group, but it is a specific legal expression that Germans are familiar with because it was a huge debate last year, and it was officially ended by the 25th of November last year. However, the instruments based on that epidemic situation of national significance can last until the 19th of March this year. After that, it can only be prolonged for 3 months. I mean, those instruments based on that situation, of that special situation, those instruments can only be prolonged for another 3 months upon a vote in the federal parliament Bundestag, a majority vote in the federal parliament Bundestag, and only once. In the meantime, however, I see how the local authorities feel they have the right to randomly instruct protesters to do this, to do that, to jump through a loop, and so forth, in order to protect supposedly the wider public from COVID. The police once even used a yardstick to walk through the protesters and see if they can harass them with fines. And there was also the situation in the city of Ulm when, I think it's still in place, actually, I'm not quite sure, but there was once this situation in the city that prohibited walking mask-free during the exact time slots when they expected protesters. So the entire city, because it's not registered, right? So the entire city, the entire inner city was banning walking outside, walking outdoors without masks, simply because they wanted to harass the protesters. That is not in line with the Constitution. And I will talk about the verdict and what it says about harassment from the police side or from the authorities side in a moment. And the reason why the local authorities seem to believe that they can go full draconian is probably paragraph 5.1, number 4 in VERSG, the Assembly Law, Versammlungsgesetz. And it says there, and I have to read exactly what it says because it's grammatically questionable. It says the organizer or his surroundings may hold views or condone speech that include crimes or other misdemeanors enforced by authorities. Now, I have to admit that I can't translate it better because the grammar is dodgy. So I'm really sorry for include. What speech include means is unclear to me. The German original is zum Gegenstand haben. That's very vague. So it can mean 3 things, basically. For one, it can mean that the speech itself is illegal. We still have anti-speech laws. The speech itself may be against a law. The subject of the speech, the purpose of the speech may be illegal, or it may address simply something that is illegal. It may address a crime. So, for example, a protest for a stronger punishment for a given crime would include in its speech the crime. So it's so grammatically vague that I cannot say if the speech is criminal or must be criminal in order to justify a ban. The purpose of the speech, or if the speech serves as a condonation of a given behavior that is violent, for example, or that is at least against the law, or third, that the speech deals with something that is forbidden. So the last interpretation could mean that whenever you protest against a prohibition, you can be banned because you include in your speech the said prohibition, the said law, crime, misdemeanor that is, somehow enforced by authorities, right? So whenever you are protesting against a prohibition, then you are likely to be banned if that is a broad interpretation of that sentence, right? On the other side, people who want to protest for a ban, for example, for banning the construction of a nuclear power station, that would not be banned. That protest would not be banned. So if you ask for bans for prohibitions, you are safe. If you want to remove existing restrictions, you are likely to quote a crime, and you include in your speech a crime. But I think in actual verdicts, in actual court cases, this has not been panned out so far. I think this sentence is basically ignored, or it's interpreted in one of the other ways, that you must either encourage misdemeanor in the protests, like you say, let's tear down something, let's destroy something, property damage. If you call for some misdemeanor or crime, that is probably the most likely interpretation of that sentence. It's just so badly phrased that it could mean anything. What is more important is that these infection control, supposedly disease control laws or regulations, that they are harassment. And the Supreme Court was actually quite clear on that. So it says in that verdict around the Proctorf nuclear power station protest that both sides have to cooperate as much as possible. So even if you're in the right, and even if you believe you're in the right, all these laws on face value, they also sound, you have to give that to the police, they sound like they can basically end every protest all the time, right? If they don't know the history of the court rulings, they can come to that conclusion, right? They feel they are on the right, and you feel that there is absolutely no reason to wear a mask outside, and that you are on the right, and you are probably more right than they are. But it doesn't really matter for your legal struggles. If you are fined, if you are beaten by a police officer, whatever may happen. So for your legal struggles, what matters is that you show a willingness to cooperate. This is important because this commands that the police officers also have to show as much cooperativeness as possible. And the authorities also have to show actually as much cooperativeness as possible. So for whatever legal struggles you may have in future or right now already, I don't know, with the authorities, you can already bring to the game that they are harassing. So they are showing a lack of cooperativeness to you. The Proctor verdict actually lists as behavior that should be avoided police operations that appear unnecessary, exaggerated, or incomprehensible. I think most people avoid court struggles in the first place, and I would suggest that most of you do, because the fines can run up to 3,000 euro for taking part in unregistered protests, and leading them can even be more expensive. Therefore, if you have the money, you can pick the bill and run through the court system on the grounds that I've just explained, and shoot the way free for others. But for most, they don't have the money, and you may decide that a registration here and there and wearing a mask and so on may be worthwhile. And the occasional court case can't be avoided, I assume, anyways. So some people will have to run with it through the courts. I just suggest that the stronger among you do that, and not everybody. And I have the impression that our politicians are into wearing the opposition out. So 3,000 euro here and 3,000 euro there, it can eventually discourage people. But maybe somebody will pick that bill and run through the courts and use that kind of reasoning that I presented to you today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.